Hi everyone, Miss Martin here, and today we are going to try and figure out what role the earthworm plays in our food chains and life cycles. And we're going to do that by analyzing some of its behaviors. And as you can see here, I got some live worms with me. Let's start with the video introduction, and then we'll do our two experiments.
In the first part of today's activity, you're going to learn about earthworms by watching one. If you observe carefully, there are lots of things to notice when you watch an animal, even a simple worm. Your worm observations will give you some ideas about the worm's role in the garden. Now, before you get started, you should know that worms might be a little slimy, but they won't hurt you. It's perfectly fine to pick up a worm with your bare hands. In fact, you have to be gentle so you don't hurt them. The more gently you handle the worm, the more of its behavior you'll get to observe. Otherwise, it may try to play dead. I'll show you how to get started, step by step.
Okay, so in the first experiment, what we're going to do is set up a little spot here on the plate for the worm. And we want to give them, try to figure out some parts of their behavior by giving them a couple options. So the first thing I did was I took this spoon and I got all of this pretty damp. We know worms seem to like wet areas. And then we're also going to give them a place to hopefully lay under. So we're gonna prop this up. Alright, so I'm gonna take one worm. We're gonna place him on the paper plate. We're gonna see how he reacts and where he chooses to go. This might take a couple minutes for him to kind of get used to his surroundings and then for him to find where the best, most comfortable place is for this worm. So you can already start to see where what seems like the head of the worm is. That's this end right here. Right now he has some senses on the top of that worm. Alright, so it looks like the worm has started to make a decision of what it wants to do. And as you can see, he is starting to head for the underneath part of underneath that black construction paper. So, does this show us that worms prefer to kind of go into dark places? Or are they preferring the dampness under there? Alright, let's see another part of this experiment as he's doing that. I want to share another video.
Discuss.
So the
Then
question
watch
is,
the next video.
why do you think the worms settled down where they did? Because every time you do this experiment, the worms always tend to try to hide underneath that black piece. Does this give you any clues about what they do in the garden? Let's watch the next video.
In order to figure out whether worms were pests or helpful, Darwin started by closely observing worms' bodies and their behaviors, just like you did. Maybe you observed some of the same things that Darwin did. First, Darwin noticed how worms have soft, flexible bodies, made of these circular ring segments. Earthworms move by squeezing and stretching these segments of their body one by one, inching their way across the surface or squeezing themselves through tiny openings. When Darwin watched worms outside, he saw that they burrowed down into the soil. They didn't like being exposed to the air, probably because it dried them out. Here's a sped up video of when we did the experiment. Notice the worm didn't have anywhere to burrow since it was on a plate, but it probably would have burrowed if it had a choice. Instead, some of our worms went underneath the paper towel where it was damp. Some of them also went under the piece of black paper, trying to get away from the light. Even though worms don't have eyes, they can still sense light. Darwin figured this out by shining candlelight on worms in a container to see how they would react. He shined light on just half of a container full of worms, and found that the worms always crawled away from the light and tried to find somewhere dark to hide. Did you figure out which end of the worm was its head? They do have a head and a tail, but it can be hard to tell which end is which. Usually when worms move, they go forward, so you can figure that end is the head. but they sometimes go backwards too. So it seems like nearly everything about a worm's body makes it ideal for living in the soil. It likes dark and damp places. It's flexible and soft, so it can squeeze into small places. And it can move forward and backward. But out of all of these characteristics, nothing seemed to suggest that worms were pests that would kill plants in a garden. They really seem harmless. They don't have ears or eyes, and their mouths are tiny. Maybe they could eat dead leaves, which are soft and easy to chew. But earthworms don't have strong jaws to chew through tough living plants the way that caterpillars do. At the end of all of his observations, Darwin found no evidence that worms were harming his garden. In fact, Darwin found something that made him think plants might actually do better when there are worms around. Darwin observed that worms were coming to the surface and leaving behind what looks like little mounds of soil. They're called worm castings. It turns out, castings are what the worm excretes. They're worm poop. Worms, when they move through the soil, bring soil from lower down in the earth upwards, creating a new layer of soil on the surface. This reminded Darwin of something he knew farmers already did to mix the soil on their farms. They plowed the soil like this in order to mix the layers and loosen it up for plants to grow. It looked like worms were doing exactly the same thing, just on a smaller scale. After almost 30 years of researching earthworms, Darwin published a book about them. In that book, he claimed that worms were actually helpful to a garden. They were like nature's plows, mixing up the soil and loosening it so that plants could grow better. Most scientists were convinced by Darwin's book that worms weren't pests after all. But not everyone was convinced. After all, worms are so small and weak. They couldn't possibly be doing that much, thought some scientists. What do you think would convince these other scientists of Darwin's claim that earthworms are actually helpful to a garden?
Alright, so while we were watching that video, we allowed the earthworm to get settled, and there he is. He chose the darker area. He actually has hid his entire body underneath of this black piece of construction paper. Now, we're still trying to figure out, are worms good or are they not? Are they a pest? So what if we learned a little bit more about what type of soil, what type of things they preferred? So we are going to do one more experiment. This time I'm going to use another worm. And we want to verify the fact that they like moist soil. So instead of moistening the entire paper plate, we're just going to do half of it. So I'm just going to go down this line here. And then we're going to try and see, does the worm prefer the damp side of the paper towel, or the dry side? Okay, that should be pretty moist. So I'm going to bring my other little earthworm friend. We are going to place him half and half. Oh, he's a regular one. And let's see where he prefers to go. Alright, it does look like he has made his choice. It looks like the majority of his body, except this segment right here, is on the wet side of the paper towel.
Try. Okay. Gently discuss. Suppose you. I don't know what you came up with, but time to do your experiment later, even if it's at home.
So let's watch the wrap up as he's making his decision.
There are lots of different experiments you could do with earthworms. You can learn a lot by watching closely, and you can experiment by changing one thing at a time. Here's just one example of an experiment we designed. We wanted to figure out, what exactly do worms like to eat? I mean, do they actually eat dirt, or do they eat stuff that's in the dirt? We decided to give worms a choice between dirt with no dead stuff in it and dirt with dead stuff in it. Now, to create a fair test, we made a worm bin out of a plastic box, and we put dirt on one side and a mixture of dirt and dead plants on the other side. We thought about other things that might affect what the worms did, like light and dampness, how wet it was in there. So we made sure the whole box was damp. And we decided we would put it in the dark. Then we put 100 earthworms in the middle of the box and waited for 2 full days for the worms to move in the box and make their choices. Then we counted the worms in each half of the box. Are you ready for this? After 2 days, when we counted the worms on each side, we found 11 worms on the side with only dirt. On the side of the box containing dirt and dead plant material, we found 89 worms. Our experiment supported the claim that earthworms prefer dirt and dead stuff. This evidence fits with what scientists have observed. Worms eat dead leaves and dead plant roots. That doesn't hurt the plants at all, the way caterpillars do. Earthworms really aren't pests. If you think about it, earthworms are actually decomposers. They have something in common with fungi, things like mushrooms and mold, and microscopic organisms like bacteria. Decomposers are responsible for breaking down all kinds of dead or decaying matter to make it usable again as soil with micronutrients for plants. Scientists also found out that if you observe soil up close through a powerful microscope, you'll find all kinds of microscopic organisms. It turns out that worms eat those tiny living things too. So to answer the question, do worms eat dirt? The answer is not exactly. Worms eat stuff in the dirt, like decaying plants, tiny living organisms like bacteria, and also animal waste. If you were to take out all of the living things and all the decaying material from the soil, earthworms wouldn't be able to survive on just the rocks and minerals left behind. Scientists like to distinguish between dirt, which doesn't have any dead or living material in it, and soil, which does. Worms prefer soil to dirt. Scientists are currently working to figure out even more ways that decomposers like worms can help us in the future, like breaking down garbage into great fertilizer for plants. Have fun and stay curious.
All right, so as we finish that video, our earthworm has settled in. He's mostly staying on that damp side. So the two things we've learned about their behavior, they like the dark, like this guy, he's just been hiding underneath there, and they like the damp, and they're actually part of the group of creatures called decomposers, because they eat dead things and other smaller creatures that are in the soil. All right, keep up the good work, guys, and I will see you next time.